right, so in our last set of notes, we talked about cooperative federalism, and we talked about how cooperative federalism is when local, state, and federal governments share responsibilities in order to solve common problems. And we talked about how a perfect example of cooperative federalism is Hurricane Harvey, because in trying to solve this problem of a hurricane destroying Houston and other cities within Texas, local, state, and federal governments kind of had to all work together, and each had certain responsibilities, and some of those responsibilities were overlapping. But nevertheless, this was an example of governments working together, cooperating with one another, and that's why cooperative federalism is also known as a marble cake, because a marble cake is a mixing of ingredients. And so it's very apparent that cooperative federalism means the mixing. It means the mixing of local, state, and federal responsibilities in order to solve problems. And another example would be grant and aids. Okay, so the federal government provides grant and aids to local and state governments when they need it. And so, again, this is another example of the federal government working with local and state governments. Instead of dual federalism, which we talked about in the past, is a clear division between who is supposed to do what, and there is not a lot of overlapping, and there is not a lot of cooperating with one another to solve problems. It's more the local government solves this problem, state government solves this problem, federal government solves this problem. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So in this set of notes, we're going to talk about why states make interstate compacts or compacts between states, and also foreign countries, as long as they're non-political compacts. We're going to talk about the full faith and credit clause, extradition, and also the privileges and immunities clause. So to start us off here, interstate compacts. These are agreements among states or non-political agreements with foreign nations. So no state can enter into a treaty or alliance. However, with the consent of Congress, they may enter into interstate compacts. Some examples, sharing of law enforcement information among the 50 states, Port Authority in New York and New Jersey, Port Authority just meaning to manage and develop the harbor facilities bordering both states. And then also understand that some 200 compacts are in force today. Some other agreements include compacts designed to prevent forest fires, combat stream and harbor pollution, provide for tax collections, and promote motor vehicle safety. And the list goes on and on. All right, so full faith and credit. States must honor another state's public acts and laws of states, records, birth certificates, marriage licenses. These will be recognized in all 50 states. So if you are considered to be married in Ohio, you'll also be considered to be married in Kentucky or any other of the 50 states. Judicial proceedings, outcome of court actions. So one example of this would be, say, Alan sues Bill in Florida, and the Florida court awards Alan $50,000 in damages. Bill cannot escape the payment of damages by moving to Georgia, because Alan could simply ask the Georgia courts to enforce the damage award, and they would have to. Neither would the case have to be retired in Georgia. Instead, the Georgia courts would have to give full faith and credit to recognize and respect the validity of the judgment made by the Florida court. Okay, so some exceptions to the full faith and credit clause. States cannot enforce another state's criminal laws. Does not apply to divorces in one state to residents of another state. And we saw this in the case of Williams versus North Carolina in 1945. If you want a divorce in one state, you must be a permanent resident there. So, a little more detail. Again, if you were granted a divorce by a state in which you were not actually a resident, then that divorce will not be upheld in another state, because the state that granted the divorce in the first place did not actually have the authority to do so. Okay? All right, extradition. Fugitive from justice in one state can be returned to that state. Usually governors okay extradition of fugitives. Occasionally they will say no. In 1897, courts can force a governor to extradite a fugitive. All right, privileges and immunities. Privileges and immunities clause, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1. A resident of one state may not be discriminated against unreasonably by another state. All citizens must obey the law of all other states while in those states. Example, smoking age in Alabama, gun laws in Illinois. States can make reasonable discrimination against residents of other states. Here are some examples. States can require a person to live there a certain amount of time before they can vote, higher fees for out-of-state hunters. Supreme Court struck down an Alaskan law giving a hiring preference to Alaskan residents for constructing the state's oil and gas pipelines. This was seen as unreasonable distinction. Another common piece of reasonable discrimination that we have seen in the past and still is in place today. State colleges and universities, they regularly set like higher tuition rates for students from out of state than those they charge their in-state residents, and this is seen as reasonable discrimination against residents of other states. So there are some areas in which that is okay, but also understand that there are some instances like this one here in Alaska that are not okay. All right, take just a quick look at this political cartoon here and see if you can figure out how it relates to the Privileges and Immunities Clause. So in this political cartoon, Indiana says, "Daddy, may I please impose burdensome regulations on Indiana corporations?" And the United States, which represents the father in this political cartoon, says, "Yes, but only if it doesn't discriminate against your brothers and sisters," meaning the other various states. And so, remember, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1. Says that a resident of one state may not be discriminated against unreasonably by another state. So, in this political cartoon, Indiana is free to impose these burdensome regulations on Indiana corporations as long as it does not unreasonably discriminate against the other states within the United States.